Listen to that. It isn't so much an engine as it is a 5-cylinder war cry from the depths of a German forest. In the mid-80s, this was the sound of a sport that had essentially decided to stop being a race and start being an act of violence against physics. It was biblical. It all started in 1981 with this, the Audi Quattro. Back then, rally cars were agricultural things with two-wheel drive and about 250 horsepower. Audi turned up with a tractor's drivetrain and changed the world. Suddenly, you didn't need talent to go fast, you just needed a differential and some dirt. Then there was Michelle Mouton. She was a French woman who drove the Quattro like she was trying to settle a personal debt with the scenery. She proved that four-wheel drive wasn't just a gimmick for farmers, it was a weapon. It made everything else look like they were racing in a different, slower, more pathetic century. By 1983, the pace was mental. Hannu Mikkola and Stig Blomqvist were hurling these Audis through the woods at speeds that were frankly terrifying. The cars were getting lighter, the turbos were getting bigger, and the drivers were essentially becoming passengers in a machine that had its own ideas about where the road ended. The regulators, in their infinite wisdom, created Group B with a cheat code. You only had to build 200 of the things to go racing. This led to cars like the Ford RS200 and the Ferrari 288 GTO, which Ferrari built 272 of and then never actually raced. It was a farce. Of course, the fans were even crazier than the cars. In Portugal, they'd stand in the middle of the track, moving only when the car was inches away. It wasn't spectating, it was a collective suicide attempt. They wanted to touch the cars, which is like wanting to touch a passing bullet because you like the metal. In 1984, the French arrived with the Peugeot 205 T16. Ari Vatanen was the pilot of this mid-engine assassin. It was small, it was nimble, and it made the Audi look like a very fast shed. The power arms race had officially moved from the laboratory to the mental asylum. It was becoming obscene. The Peugeot was a purpose-built monster masquerading as a shopping car. It had a tubular space frame and a four-wheel drive system that worked. It won everything. Suddenly, the Audi engineers realized that their front-heavy Pioneer was about as aerodynamic and agile as a chest of drawers. They had to react. The British tried to help with the MG Metro 6R4. It was a British Leyland hatchback with a 3-litre V6 from a Jaguar XJ220 and a body kit designed by someone who'd only ever seen a car in a comic book. It was loud, it was wide, and it was brilliantly, wonderfully British madness. The 6R4's engine revved to 10,000 RPM. It sounded like a chainsaw being fed into a jet turbine. It didn't have a turbo, just raw NA grunt. It was peak 80s. It was the sort of car that made you proud to be British, right up until the moment it inevitably broke down and caught fire. Audi's response was the S1E2. They took the original Quattro and chopped 320 millimeters out of the middle because it was so fast its own length was the enemy. It had wings that belonged on a fighter jet and an appetite for gravel that was essentially a form of gluttony. Inside, Walter Röhrl was doing things with his feet that shouldn't be possible for a human. He was dancing on the pedals while the car tried to rip his head off. The S1E2 was producing 600 horsepower by 1986. That's more than a modern Ferrari on a surface made of marbles. The numbers were terrifying. 0 to 60 in 3.1 seconds on gravel. That isn't acceleration. That's being hit in the small of the back by a wrecking ball. It had a recirculating turbo system that kept the boost high at all times, making it as subtle as a landmine. But then came the Lancia Delta S4. This was the freak of the group. It used a system called twin charging. It had a supercharger for the low end and a massive turbo for the top end. Lancia's chief engineer called the supercharger the motor that starts the motor. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering. The S4 stayed under the 2500cc limit, which meant it could weigh just 890 kilos. It was essentially a Kevlar tent with 500 horsepower. There was no lag. You stepped on the throttle and the horizon simply arrived before you'd finished thinking about it. It was mental. The road-going version cost 100 million Italian lira, which is about $220,000 today. For a hatchback, Lancia only built about 100 of them because they were so complicated and so expensive that even the Italians realized they'd gone too far. It was a car for the end of days. Driving an S4 was like trying to ride a tiger through a library. It was loud, violent, and completely unpredictable. Henri Toivonen was the man who mastered it. He was a Finn, which means he was born with a steering wheel in his hands and a total lack of the fear gene. He was spectacular. Toivonen won the 1985 Racing Rally in the S4's debut. He was 29 years old and the fastest man on Earth. He had won the RAC in 1980 at just 24, a record that stood for nearly 30 years. He was the golden boy of a sport that was about to lose its mind. In 1986, the wheels came off. In Portugal, Joaquim Santos lost control of his Ford RS 200 and plowed into the crowd. 3 people died. 31 were injured. The top teams pulled out immediately. The sport had become too fast for the people watching it, and frankly too fast for the people driving it. Then came the Tour de Corse. Toivonen was leading. He was 7 kilometers into stage 18 on a section called Lagoa Azul when he simply disappeared off the road. There were no witnesses. There was no skid mark. There was just a car that had plunged down a ravine and erupted into a fireball. The fuel tank ruptured, the Kevlar bodywork burned so fiercely that only the blackened space frame remained. Henri Toivonen and his American co-driver Sergio Cresto were gone. It was a tragedy that was as inevitable as it was shocking. The cars had finally outrun the ability of humans to control them. Within hours of the crash, Vice President Jean-Marie Balestre announced that Group B was banned. It was the fastest decision the FIA has ever made. They didn't even wait for the funeral. The most exciting, most dangerous, most mental era in motorsport history was over in a single afternoon. Frankly, it had to be. The replacement was Group A. It had a 300 horsepower cap and required 5,000 road cars to be built. It was boring on purpose. It was like replacing a squadron of fighter jets with a fleet of very safe, very sensible Volvos. The fire had gone out, replaced by a wet blanket of regulation. The cars didn't quite die, though. Walter Röhrl took the S1 to Pikes Peak in 1987 and set a new record. It was a final middle finger to the regulators. These machines were too fast for the woods, so they went to the mountains to live out their retirement as legends of a lost age. We will never see their like again. We live in a world of health and safety and subsections of regulations. But for 4 years we had monsters in the forests. They were obscene, they were dangerous, and they were the greatest things on 4 wheels.